about the one thing you got. Okay, well send it to the person that gives the lecture. Don't send them to him, send them to me. For this one and for the next one, whoever gives it.
You can email it on the board?
Yeah, well, yeah, BXL14.
BXL.
And my middle name is not Xavier. So, you know, and I just have to tell you, looking over some of those emails that you sent, it amazes me what people remember. You know, there's a lot of stuff to try to remember, but, you know, one of you said, well, it's amazing birds don't have hyaline cartilages. Like, wow, you're right, but that really wasn't what it was about. Birds don't have teeth either. But do you know that birds still have the genes that you can turn them on and they can now create chickens that have teeth? How scary is that?
Wait, chickens?
And that isn't all. You can take a chicken, and if you take its tibia and its fibula, what happens in a chicken is they grow together. But if you take a piece of mica, a very thin mica, and you just use mica because it can make it so thin, and you put it in, as an embryo between those two bones so they can't join, you know what happens? It turns into a dinosaur foot. Is that not amazing? You could, but they never let them grow up. Probably good. I'd love to see a chicken with teeth and a dinosaur foot. Wouldn't you like to see that? Okay, bones. Just a quick review. What are the three kinds of bones? The hard stuff. Cortical. The stuff inside under the joints. Trabecular cancellous. Or spongy. You can call it spongy. I don't care. How about, what's the other? What's the third? Well, I call it woven. But I should make clear for you guys, it's not woven. It's what you would call alveolar bone. It's the stuff that happens, it's disorganized, it has a high protein matrix, it's not well mineralized. If you break a bone, you create woven bone, but the amazing thing is in the mandible, the top of the mandible where the teeth insert, and also the maxilla. It's alveolar bone. It's very reactive bone, which is why if any of you are going into orthodontics, that's where you can move the teeth around. If you had a crocodile as your patient, don't put the braces on because you can't move them. That's a uniquely mammal thing. Mammals also only have two sets of teeth, a deciduous and then the adult, which I think is kind of, why do we do that? I'd rather have teeth like crocs or like sharks that you can just replace them as they fall out. Yeah, well, that's just the way it goes. Now, so those are the types of bone. What's the type of cartilage?
Hyaline.
Hyaline, which is the slippery stuff. What else? Fibro,
Cartilage.
which is the stuff in your discs. And
Elastic.
elastic, yeah. Now let's just start with cartilage. Chondrogenesis. Chondro just means cartilage. Chondrogenesis, it comes from mesenchyme, and I don't think you're going to get this when you do embryology, I think. It's mesenchymal stem cells. It's mesoderm. And I'm just looking for somebody to go, oh yeah, I've heard of that before. Don't worry about it. It comes from mesenchyme that then differentiates into chondroblasts. And chondroblasts then differentiate into chondrocytes. Now the amazing thing about the hyaline cartilages, which we want to talk about, is as I pointed out to you, it's so thin because it doesn't have a vascular system. It doesn't have a nervous system either. It's essentially dead tissue almost. It gets its nutrients through diffusion. So it's limited to 3 to 4 millimeters in thickness. That isn't very thick. And that means that it can't absorb much energy. So it could absorb energy if you could make it thicker, but you can't. It'd be like the difference between having an inch of foam rubber versus 2 feet of foam rubber. If you fall on 2 feet of foam rubber, it'll absorb a lot of impact. An inch of foam rubber ain't going to do you much good if you fall from high enough height. Well, that's what cartilage is like. So it can't really absorb much energy. But there's an important thing. It doesn't have a membrane around it. Now you're thinking, what the hell does that mean? It means it's pressure tolerant. It can tolerate pressure because what's the problem with pressure? Well, the problem with pressure is your bone here is surrounded in periosteum, right? And periosteum is highly vascularized. It has a great little nervous system. And that's what feeds the bone, the external periosteum. Peri meaning around, osteum meaning bone. That's how you can create osteoblasts. It creates osteoblasts that then allow you to increase the size of the bone. Problem is periosteum, if you push on it, what happens is then it dies because you get necrosis. You cut off its own blood supply, and then the bone underneath will necrose. And you don't want that. So that's why, does anyone know what a squatting facet is? Okay, a squatting facet is this. If you go to some place where people don't use chairs, or if you think about it, nobody ever had a chair until about 300 years ago. Everybody sits in a squat. Go to Mexico, everybody still does it. Do that, and what happens is you're dorsiflexing your foot so strongly, for long periods of time, you end up with something called a squatting facet. And that's because of you pushed on the periosteum, and you actually get necrosis there and the bone resorbs. It's the wrong end of the body for you guys, I know. Okay, so, really quickly, endochondral osteogenesis. That just means one way to build a bone. This is the one from the neck down. This is the one that really happened when we came on land. When our ancestors came on land, what happens all of a sudden, you have a problem with pressure and gravity. If you're in the ocean, don't worry about it. You don't have an issue. But when you come on land, you do have a problem. So you have to figure out a way to grow your bones. And you can't do it with a membrane because the membrane will die because of the pressure. So we invented osteogenesis or endochondral. And you know what that means. You take a hyaline cartilage model, and this is in the fetus. You take a hyaline cartilage model, you put in a growth center here, you surround it in perichondrium. I just found this colored chalk. How exciting. You surround it in pericardium, you then give it a vascular supply, it then starts to ossify in these directions, and you end up with it mineralizing. Then, you change this to the periosteum.
Interesting.
So you now have, the perichondrium just turns into the periosteum. It's no big deal. You have the periosteum, which is the membrane that goes around the bone. Then you create a secondary center and a medullary canal. And this is the epiphysis, right? Secondary center is your epiphysis. Your primary center is in the middle of your diaphysis. So this is a diaphysis. This is the epiphysis. And I think this is the physis or the growth plate, cartilaginous growth plate. And, well, as we go on, you have the growth plate there, which is really an anatomy called the physis. You can see that's what's the epiphysis. This is the metaphysis where it flares out. I don't think you guys have to know that. I don't think. If you want to know, it's called the metaphysis. That's the flaring above a joint. Why does a joint flare out?
Absorb pressure.
What?
Absorb pressure?
Yeah, it's stress, right? Stress is force over area. So since you can't make cartilage thicker, if you increase the force, then you have to increase your area to hold it constant, right? Makes sense. So this is a way to protect your joints is the flare.
So you're drawing like a leg and the knee joint above it, kind of?
The what?
Like a leg and the knee joint above it? Is that kind of, I don't have context of what you're drawing.
Oh, what I'm just saying is that's why you have a flare in a joint.
Just
It increased the surface area to protect the cartilage.
This bone, this joint, or
Anything from the neck down.
So the diaphysis is where the primary ossification center is.
Yes,
right?
that's the shaft.
And so what about, so this, is there a secondary ossification center in the epiphysis?
Yes.
Right? And then, so
Yeah,
it skips.
secondary ossification of both of your epiphyses.
So and there's nothing going on, so the metaphysis essentially is going to stay hyaline cartilage
Well,
until you age and grow enough.
and you fuse it.
Fuse it.
But that's the reason you flare the joints. And you also, inside of the joint, if you cut into it, you have cancellous bone. And that's because cancellous bone is more compliant, so you won't squash your cartilage. Because remember, cartilage can't heal itself. If you damage it, you're cooked. So the body has to do all these things to save this stuff. Now, to go from a straight bone into a bone like this, how are you going to do it? That's where the whole thing of remodeling comes in. This is a big point. You can only add bone and take it away. That's it. That's all you got. So to add bone, you add it up here at the growth plate, and you have cartilage that begins to mineralize. And because cartilage is tolerant of stress, of pressure, it allows you to continue to grow bone until you fuse it. If you put just hyaline cartilage, if you just had bone there, it couldn't do it. Bone couldn't tolerate the pressure because of the periosteum. But there is no periosteum here, just hyaline cartilage, and that's how you can grow this stuff. So you create these cartilage canals that begin to mineralize, and that's why your bone gets longer and longer. And that's endochondral, this is all endochondral ossification. But the weird thing is, okay, if we cut through here and look at that end of the bone, this is your cortex. That's your medullary canal, because we're cutting right through the middle. Like if I took this tibia and cut it like right there. Well, we have to make that bigger too, right? It makes sense. Otherwise, you can't have a bone that's skinny like it was when you were born. Wouldn't last you very long. So you have to, if you cut through that, how do we get to that? Well, we have the periosteum around the outside. It has osteoblasts in it. And the osteoblasts lay down bone. So it's a deposition of osseous tissue. So you're gaining bone, making it bigger. And you know what that is? That's endochondral, or that's rather intramembranous. So long bones have intramembranous bone growth as well as endochondral. At the same time, you don't want this thing, you don't want your bones to weigh too much, so you end up taking bone away in here. And I'll just put a plus for adding bone, deposition, and for removing bone, resorbing bone, we'll put in minus.
Sorry, you said the intramembranous ossification that occurs is it's the periosteum?
It's periosteum, but it's only in the shaft. It's not at the ends of the bone. The intramembranous in the long bone is only in the shaft. Because there's no pressure on it. You could do it this way.
So does your medullary cavity stay the same once it's formed?
No, it gets bigger too.
It does.
And the way it gets bigger is you have another membrane, in here, called the endosteum. You know, when you go through the program you're going through, half of what you do is you have to learn new terminology. That really is a huge thing. It's like learning another language. And you guys are just doing this. And eventually this stuff will be second, rate to you. You'll learn it, but you just have to sit down and just learn these terms. Because when you talk to people, that's what they're going to talk about, is this kind of stuff. So the endosteum is here, and the endosteum creates osteoclasts. And an osteoclast eats bone away, it resorbs bone. So osteoblasts grow bone, osteoclasts resorb bone. So one deposits, and one takes it away. And what happens with the osteoblasts is they create, you've got a cartilaginous growth plate up here, that then creates osteoblasts that then secrete osteoid, which is non-mineralized collagen, and the osteoid then begins to mineralize, and in doing so it starts to trap osteoblasts inside the bone. And the ones that get stuck in there are called osteocytes, which is an old osteoblast that got trapped in its own secretions and can't get out. So if this is kind of, is this making sense to you? I hope. In Wolff's Law we talked about. At this stage when you're growing, if you load that bone, it will actually hypertrophy. It will get bigger. And the big example of all that are tennis players. The racket arm of a tennis player, I mean the pros, is a good bit thicker than is his other arm, in his humerus, because he's banging on that thing hours a day as a kid. So, diaphysis, surrounded in periosteum, it grows by deposition on the ends of the bone. You also get bone being taken away from the endosteum in here, creating osteoclasts, and that hollows it out. Same thing is going on up here. That's how you can make this curve. Because what happens is it grows, you can't have it just continue to grow, so you start taking bone away from here with osteoclasts, and as it grows in that direction, you start changing the curvature. So you're constantly remodeling the bone as it grows. Once it's fused, the remodeling is very limited. You have to almost break a bone to do anything like this. But as in a kid, all this is going on. So you're mineralizing this as you go with calcium salts. So that's basically endochondral ossification. The take-home message on this one is remember that the reason the cartilage is there is you can push on it, you can put pressure on it, and you won't cut off its blood supply because it doesn't have a blood supply. Bone, if you pushed on it the wrong way, it'll cut off its blood supply at the periosteum, and then it'll die. Aseptic necrosis.
I got a question.
Sure.
It's been bugging me. So, like, why is it, you said that when you hit the periosteum, that bone tissue will die, right?
Yeah, well, you're not just hitting it once, but if you push on it for a long time,
Okay.
or repeatedly keep banging at the same place.
Why is it then that, like, I don't know why, this is what I immediately thought of. Why is it like in Thailand that they these Thai fighters whack their shins with bamboo sticks and make them more calcified? Wouldn't that be killing their...
Well, if you do it long enough, it's not going to do you much good. I mean, if you do it if you do it without too much force, you will probably stimulate the periosteum to create osteoblasts and then lay down some more bone.
Okay.
But if you push on it continuously, which is what happens in braces, when you have braces, you tighten those braces and it pushes on one side of the leading edge of the tooth that pushes against that bone, the periosteum that's in there, and that causes the bone to resorb. And then it fills in behind with osteoblasts. That's how you can move teeth around. So if it's continuous force or repeated force, what happens is you'll resorb bone. Now, so that's one kind. Now, how about the basic thing to know here is that you start with the cartilaginous model and you build on them. You mineralize the model and then build on that. The other kind of bone growth is intramembranous. Intramembranous bone does not use a cartilaginous model. That's the key. This is an old way to make bone. That big fish I showed you the other time, Dunctal osseous, incidentally, you should go over to the Natural History Museum. You can get in for free, just show them your case card. You can get in for free, and right now they have a great show on mastodons and mammoths. It's really good, you should see it. And as long as you're there, go and look at Dunkelostes, that great big giant fish. The great one. At the bone density, it's called the volume fraction, just bone density, of the L2 vertebra. And I chose that because clinically that's what they do. And sure enough, I mean, it looks just like you'd expect. If this is density, and this is age, it was like that. And this would be, you're peaking out at about 24, and then you hit menopause and you really drop off at about 45. No shock. Okay, we knew that. Then I said, you guys should like this. I said, I'm going to take x-rays of their mandibles and look for a signal that says osteoporosis. So when you have a patient come in, you can look at their x-rays and say, hey, you ought to go get your bone density checked. Makes sense to me, doesn't it to you? Should be a slam dunk project. So I laid out all these x-rays of the mandibles, and it was a blind study, so I didn't know who they were or how old they were. And I seriated them. And then, having done that, then we went back and looked at the bone densities and the ages, and there's no correlation. The mandible does not lose bone like the rest of the skeleton. My guess is because it's membranous bone. I don't know what protects membranous bone from bone loss. I do not know, because it doesn't work in the postcranium. But anyway. So we've got cortical bone, right? Trabecular bone. Got that. Okay, what's that? I didn't bring my list today of all these terms. What other terms do we have on here? Somebody have that?
What term are you looking for?
I don't know. Anything you don't know. Before I start the slides. Nutrient. Okay, the nutrient frame, and that's a good one. Since a bone, if you look at a femur, the nutrient frame is right here. And that's where, when I talk about how you get the vascular system going into the primary growth center, that's the vascular system right there. And then you grow up and down from that, proximal and distal from that point. But the nutrient frame is always about in the middle of the bone, unless it's a peculiar bone that grows at a weird rate.
So that's not an intramembranous then? It's just an endochondrial?
That's endochondrial, yeah. Intramembranous has that membrane around it that feeds it. So they're skull bones, and just let me say, because you're going to bump into this. If you cut through a parietal, you don't have a medullary cavity in a parietal, or in a frontal bone, and actually in your skulls, you know. What you have, you do have a cavity. It's filled with trabecula. It is called the diplo. So it's not really a medullary canal. You have cortical bone, what's called extracranial, intracranial bone, and then in the middle you have diplo. That normally has marrow in it. And even as an adult, it still has red marrow. And there's a condition where if you don't get enough iron, and this happens in kids a lot when they're growing, if you don't get enough iron, what happens is you get these little pits in the top of your orbits. Because what's happening is your body's trying to make blood cells, and can't because it doesn't have enough iron. It doesn't have heme for hemoglobin. So you get these little pits. And you know who that happened to a lot in the American Indians. And the reason is that they were grinding their corn on limestone that would lock up all the iron so their bodies couldn't absorb it. Oh, here it is, okay. Hyaline cartilages, fibrocartilage, subchondral bone. We got it. Lamellar bone, okay, I'll tell you about, we haven't really talked about that. Once you have an adult bone that's totally fused, that's it. You're not going to grow it anymore. You're not going to grow that once you fuse with that growth plate. And that happens, I told you, at different times, so you can age a skeleton in a forensic sense if you want to. So once that fuses, that's it. But remember, bone tissue is living. And it has a vascular system. So there's something called cut and fill cones. And that's in your book. So what happens over time, first of all, you got to get the calcium out of there and put more calcium back. So you have a flow of calcium, so you have to have a blood supply to get it in and out. Also, as bone ages, it starts to delaminate. Bone is set up and laminar collagen lays itself down almost like plywood, back and forth like this. So it's what's called imbricating. And then it mineralizes, so it's really tough stuff. Well, eventually, those start to delaminate with age. Anyone here ever had a fatigue fracture? Stress fracture? What were you doing?
I was running.
Yeah, that'll do it. Anyone else? Well, what that means is you literally start to get little fatigue fractures, and you have it in your ankle?
My tibia.
Your tibia? Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Where was yours?
My second metatarsal.
Yeah, that makes sense too, because you're loading those repeatedly and repeatedly, and all that force starts to delaminate. And that's what happens is you start to develop real fractures. And that's why in the Army they're really careful, like guys, they really make sure that they're in good condition before they send them on a forced march long distance. Now I'm going to tell you just new. This is so cool. Male soldiers we knew would get them in their feet, because those are little tiny bones. I'm surprised we don't break them all the time. Look at that. Well, the reason you don't break them all the time, what takes up the energy of those muscles we talked about, your quadricep, and those muscles, what's called eccentric contraction, they take up the muscle, turn it into heat, that's why you sweat. Well, if you haven't worked out enough and those muscles fatigue, then what happens is these little tiny bones literally start to get fractures in them. You also get them in your fibula and in your distal tibia, and then you're no good to anybody. You're laid up for a long time. Well, in Iraq, it's the first time women, probably on the history of the planet, have actually been not forced, they signed up. They have to carry these heavy backpacks. You know, and they didn't tell. They made them carry the same backpacks that the men are carrying. Now that isn't fair, I'm sorry. But they made them do that, made them go on these marches. Do you know what? Women don't get fatigue fractures so much in their feet like men. You know where they get them? In their hips. They get them in their iliac blade. Because women have wider hips because of the birth canal. You've all noticed that, I think. Women have wider hips, and the big muscles, the abductors on the side of your hip, pull over and over, and they start getting fatigue fractures in the hip. Nobody knew that. So I got an engineering friend of mine, and I said, let's figure out how to make a backpack that they won't have that happen. No, sorry, couldn't do it. Just give them a smaller backpack. That's all you can do. Because if we were going to make one column in the middle and lighter columns on the side, it doesn't work. So just give them a lighter backpack. Anyway, fatigue fracture. So you got to repair these things. So in order to do that, you have to make these cut and fill codes. And if you look at what these things look like, here's a cone. Osteoclasts are here. You've got a vascular system. It doesn't really matter, but osteoclasts have to be delivered to where they're going with a blood supply. So you've got arterioles coming in here, and back here you have osteoblasts. So these guys are laying down bone, these guys are cutting into bone, and that creates something called a secondary osteome. Or if you want to be fancy, an Haversian canal. Haversian system, Haversian canal. And if you look at the end of a cut bone, if you cut crossways through a bone and look at it histologically, it looks like this. Concentric circles, because that's what these guys are doing. So in order to repair the bone, you're constantly removing it and laying new bone down that creates these secondary osteomes.
So you'd see a lot of that cone activity on within the fracture itself?
Yeah. What happens is the bone starts to sense that it's getting weak because you're getting more strain, more movement. And it sends these guys in. And what they do is take out the dead cells and then lay down new cells. But it takes a long time. If you have a fatigue fracture, for God's sake, don't go out running next week. How long did it take yours to heal?
I'd still be like, it's taken like a really long time.
A really long time. And when you start running again, start slowly. Anybody here have shin splints? Yeah, see, there you go. I mean, you know what those are? It's, you know, it's really, it's shin splints. We used to think they were fatigue fractures, early fatigue fractures, but they're not. There's a big membrane that goes around. The problem being a biped is getting the blood from your feet back to your heart. It's not easy. It's a long column of fluid. And that's why they tell, you know, when guys stand at attention for too long and then they collapse on the ground, yeah, it's because it's pooling, all the blood's pooling in their feet. So in order to get it up there, humans have taken a really thick membrane and wrapped it around our lower limb. It's called fascia lata, if you want to know. And it's inelastic. So there's something called a calf pump. So you've got all those vessels running down to your foot, but you've wrapped it in this band, and then when you contract the muscles and the muscles expand because they're contracted, they push the blood up. And you have one-way valves in your lower limb. So it pushes the blood up and stops, and pushes it up and stops, and pushes it up and stops. That's how you get the blood back to your heart. You know, you guys, so you're thinking, what has this got to do with me? Well, I'm just telling you, shin splints are when those muscles have started to, you push them too hard, and they start to expand, and they don't drop down. They start to inflame, and once they inflame, what happens is then you can't get the blood supply in here because of that inelastic membrane. You can't get it in there, and that's where the pain comes from. And if it gets really bad, they have to go in with a scalpel and cut through that membrane so the muscles can expand out because they cut off their own blood supply. That's what a shin splint is. Again, only humans get that.
Sorry, can you go back to the cone that you were talking
Yeah.
about? So it's like a lateral view of the...
This is a lateral view, and histologically it does look kind of cone-ish. And what you're doing is the bone is, this also takes out the calcium and the phosphate to get it back into your serum, but it also is repairing. And so when it goes in, you've got a leading edge of these osteoclasts. And they come in through the vascular system because that's the only way they came.
Okay.
So they come in that way, and they are biting in like that.
So what, in the central canal, you mean?
Yes. So inside, if you look inside of a Haversian system, right here there's a vessel. Right in the middle of it is a vessel. That's the vessel. And that's what supplies the osteocytes, the bone cells that are still alive.
Yeah.
So you've got these things all over. If you're old enough, you've recycled your skeleton almost completely. And there was a thought that you could age somebody from this. Didn't work.
And so just on the outside, is it fair to say that on the outside of every Haversian system, on the very, very outside, that's where you'd find the osteoblasts?
Inside of this thing, if you were to cut it this way,
Yeah.
what you would see, cells here, these are the osteocytes. And then you've got the vessel running through here, and you're getting little arterioles going
Okay.
to keep those cells alive.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, and the cells are trapped in here. So if you want to make more bone, you have to do it by depositing it like this. You can't, there's no room inside of a bone because it's mineralized tissue, so you can't double the cells, you can't triple the cells the way you could in a muscle or something. Or you can't even expand the cell size. You're kind of limited.
Gotcha.
Anything else? All right, I'm just going to run through some slides fast. But this, basically, we're going to touch on the same stuff. And I'm going to do, in the slides, I'm going to, all right, well, there's a Haversian system. See that hole in the middle? That's where the vessel runs. And you can see the concentric circles. That's where that secondary osteon is pushed through that cut and fill cone. Yeah, we know this. Yeah, hyaline cartilage models. External area, we know this. Yeah, blah, blah. Ends of the bones. Yeah, your trachea and bronchi are held open. That's what holds open the trachea. They're stiff cartilage. Intervertebral discs, they give us all kinds of trouble. A meniscus in your knee, that's fibrocartilage. Have you guys gone through this? 4 types of tissue? Okay, well, this is all connective tissue. That's what cartilage and bone is. Most of it comes from mesoderm. Some of it comes from ectoderm, the neural crest cells, but you'll get that later. Okay, this is look at the chondrocytes. So you go through a chondroblast to a chondrocyte and finally to cartilage. And those are the 3 different types of cartilage. In bones, from an osteoblast to an osteocyte. An osteocyte is just an osteoblast that trapped itself, can't get out. Compact bone, spongy bone, they don't have woven here. Chondrocytes, yeah, we know. The one thing is that cartilage, particularly hyaline cartilage, is 60 to 80% of water, which is what gives it that resilience, its compliance, because when you squish it, it pushes the water out and you get a hydrostatic pressure. So that it does absorb some energy, but not a lot. Yeah, same stuff. Costal cartilage, get hyaline cartilage in where your ribs meet your sternum. And I don't have time to talk about it, but it's a real, if you ever want to know about breathing, I just finished a big paper on ribs. Humans breathe in a fashion that other mammals don't. Because when it stood up, we lost something called a visceral pump. If you think of a horse galloping or a dog galloping, what happens is when they come down on their front leg, all of their guts, their viscera, slams up against their diaphragm and pushes out the air. And then when they push off, it pulls it back, and it pulls their diaphragm, and they inhale. So all mammals, all quadrupeds breathe at the same rate when they're running. Humans don't. If you ever run next to somebody, humans all breathe at different times because we lost that whole mechanism. We totally lost that mechanism, so we had to come up with other ways to breathe. Yeah, it's an ear, elastic cartilage. We know. Discs, yeah, we got you. This is the weakest point in the human body, incidentally, is the lumbar curve, where those discs are. If you, I won't even say, all of you are going to herniate a disc sometime in your life. Sorry, but just a bad design. Well, that's just where cartilage is.
Most of you guys will accept it.
So we've got in our trachea and larynx to keep the thing open. Although, it didn't work very well. Should have used stiffer material there, because if you have asthma, that's not stiff enough to stop. It collapse. Same stuff. Okay, so there's 2 types of growth. I guess I haven't get this enough. One is appositional, and in that type you grow from the outside. You apply more tissue to the outside. That's what bone usually has to do once it's fused, because it can't really grow inside because it's locked up in mineralized tissue. Growth from within is interstitial. Interstitial growth, cartilage can do that. Interstitial just means that you can grow either by multiplying the cells, or you can make the cells bigger, or you can create an extracellular matrix and make things bigger. The bone can't do that. That's the point there. Yeah, chondrocytes stop dividing in your late teens. Too bad. If you can come up with a way to stimulate cartilage to grow, you could retire. It's just bone. We already know this. The osteoblast, the osteocyte. Remember, osteoblasts build bone, osteoclasts take it away, they resorb it. So, an osteocyte is an osteoblast trapped inside the matrix, the mineralized matrix. We haven't talked about hematopoietic stem cells. You don't want to. I don't think we have to. Inside, you make blood cells inside the marrow of your bone. So that's one of the ways, which is why people that have leukemia, and they have to go in and they have to take a plug out of their pelvis to look at if they're producing any red blood cells, which is terribly painful. Yeah, a question?
Can you explain the 2 types of growth again?
Okay, there's appositional growth, which is growth coming, you can build on the outside of the material by applying more, osteoblast. Then there's interstitial. Interstitial is what cartilage can do, and that actually grows from inside the material, because it's squishy material. So you can add more water in your extracellular matrix. You can have cells go through a mitosis. You can do these to make things bigger. You can't do that in bone because you're trapped. And you can't, the cells are in there stuck. And they can't do anything. They can't add more bone once they're in there. So that's why you've got this aversion system to go in there and take out the old cells, also to release the mineral and repair the bone.
So like the epiphyseal line before it comes to plate, that's going to be interstitial growth?
Yes, that's interstitial growth. Good call. That's interstitial growth, that you make these cartilage columns and then they start to ossify, they start to calcify, and that's how the bone grows. If you had a periosteum membrane there, the pressure of gravity of just standing would stop the growth. Bones, yeah, we know what bones do. You guys are head people, you don't care about this. Okay, look at that, you can see up there, there's the external table, the internal, and the diplo in the middle. That's what a skull bone looks like, a parietal if you cut through it. And that's also hemopoietic, that's blood-forming tissue too. Oh, and a patella. I forgot about this. Your kneecap is also intramembranous, which is kind of peculiar. But I guess, what else are you going to do with it? Why do you have a patella?
Because of friction crawling when you're a baby?
No, it increases the moment arm, the lever of your quadricep muscle, the big muscle in your thigh. So your quadricep goes down, attaches on your patella, then attaches onto your tibia, a place called the tuberosity. And when you contract that muscle, that adds a great big moment arm, so that it gives an advantage to the muscle. We really know that because it used to be people would get in automobile accidents before they would wear their seatbelts, and their knees would hit the dashboard and explode their patella. And they could go and take it out. Now they can give you a fake patella. But for a while they couldn't. And women hated this because when you remove that moment arm, you can walk without a patella, but your muscle hypertrophies to get so big to compensate for the lack of leverage that women are getting these big giant quadriceps. Which in today's world I don't think is so bad. I think people would say that's kind of cool. But 30 years ago, no one liked that. Okay. This is just showing you the medullary canal. You can see the medullary canal. You can see the growth plate, the epiphyseal line. You can see the trabecular bone or spongy bone. I don't care what you call it. The vascular system running through the whole thing. Diaphysis, epiphysis. And as I said up there, there's another one that you call it apophysis because it doesn't have a joint. By definition, an epiphysis has to have a joint. Yeah.
So going back to the previous slide, is that square the nutrient framework?
Yeah. Yeah, the one going right in the middle? That's it. That was the original growth center. The primary growth center was fed by that nutrient frame, and then the bone grows above it and below it, the proximal and distal. And that's why it always remains pretty much in the middle, except for a couple of bones, like the tibia. The tibia is more proximal because the distal tibia grows much faster than the proximal tibia.
It all depends on where it grows.
Yeah, it depends on just how it grows. Here's diplo. You guys are going to see a lot of that. Yeah, we've already seen this. Periosteum, that's an important thing because that keeps the bone alive, but it's also, it creates the osteoblasts. And the endosteum is inside the medullary canal, but the endosteum is really, that's like 2 cells thick. It is a really, really thin membrane. The periosteum is pretty thick. And it's, I think I mentioned, when you're eating ribs and you get that thing that peels off, that's the periosteum. I don't believe this. I just put it on there so you can see the trabecular bone. So we have trabecular bone underneath the joint to absorb that energy. It's less dense. It's more compliant. This idea that it's laid down according to force, don't buy it. It's different kinds of bones. This is for a different class. That's why I'm blowing through this, because you guys don't have to know this. compact bones, there you go. There you can see the osteomes, secondary osteomes. And if you look at the circumferential lamella, see how it wraps around? So you've got your secondary osteomes, your reversion system, and then you wrap all those in lamellae, and then you wrap the whole darn thing. And these are your reversion canals, so that's how you get to the osteocytes to feed them blood. There's a periosteum. That's just that's an osteome. And that's called the central canals where the vessel is, and you've wrapped it around and laid down those cells, and that's when I talk about how that cut and fill cone, it leaves kind of a target like that. That's how the bone repairs itself. Spongy bone, yeah, it's trabecular bone, same material, just displaced so it's not so compact. I don't think you have to know this, but if you do have to know it, bone is primarily, the matrix is made up of collagen. Collagen is the most common soft tissue in your body. Collagen makes up muscles, it makes up your lungs, it makes up everything is soft. And that makes up about 35% of bone, and the rest of it is hydroxyapatite or calcium phosphate, calcium salts. Osteogenesis, yeah, we know. Intramembranous. The thing to remember about that, you don't use a cartilaginous model, intramembranous. You do an endochondral. You use hyaline cartilage to make bone, and then you take that hyaline cartilage as a model, what's called an onlogin, and you calcify it. Yeah, mesenchyme. You know what mesenchyme are? They're little tiny cells that are undifferentiated like a stem cell. They can turn into a bunch of different tissues. There's intramembranous ossification, but does that help anybody? I mean, it really doesn't. I mean, what happens here is you end up with some of the mesenchyme turning into collagen that then mineralizes into an osteoblast that releases osteoid. Osteoid is a non-mineralized tissue, collagen primarily, and then that mineralizes and you end up with the bone. But what you would just want to remember, this type does not utilize a cartilaginous model. Endochondral stuff, yeah. You know, there we've seen this before. You can see the epiphyses, the metaphysis, the diaphysis, the articular cartilage on both ends of the bone. And that's the nutrient framing going right to the middle. I don't think you care about the histology of this, not yet. You know, I'll be teaching on histology probably next year. So we'll talk about this then. And this just shows the epiphyseal growth plates in a child. You can see where the little arrows are. That's a growth plate. And that's where the bone is being deposited. Now I'll tell you a good question, for which I do not have an answer. This is a kid's hand. In your thumb, the growth plate is on the proximal end of the bone. In your fingers, the growth plate is on the distal end of the bone. So your thumb is a totally different mechanism than your fingers, the way it grows. I don't know why. It's always bugged me though. So, see, that kind of thing keeps me awake at night. I know you guys aren't going there. All right. We talked about vitamin. We did talk about vitamin D, right? If you don't get vitamin D, then you get rickets or osteomalacia. Parathyroid hormone. Do you guys have endocrinology? No. All right. Well, I mean, these will be made available to you. And if you want to know, parathyroid hormone increases the calcium, takes it out, and then calcitonin stops it. And then the sex hormone. Bone remodeling osteoclast, you know that. Yeah. Terms, forget that. That's healing of bones, not the fracture. All right. That's all.
Are you gonna put both days of your slides up?
Yeah. Yeah, like.